We have a spy story tonight, so I thought I might just start feeling a little undercover here. You know, before I came down, before we introduced our speaker, I just want to say that I checked out online and found that there's a website called Women in War Who Were Spies. And I thought you might get a kick out of a little, when I talked to Chuck about this, he thought you'd enjoy it, a little idea of what else was going on in the world in terms of spies back in this era before we get to the specific story that Chuck's going to share with us. During the Civil War, Belle Boyd spied for the Confederacy by carrying important letters and papers across enemy lines. She was imprisoned in a Union prison for her espionage activities. Ironically, before the war ended, Belle Boyd married a Captain Harding, a Union naval officer. The story of Ginny and Lottie Moon is a fascinating one, two sisters who cleverly and brazenly spied for the Confederates during the Civil War and got away with it. Nancy Hart served as a Confederate scout, guide and spy, carrying messages between the Southern armies. She hung around isolated federal outposts, acting as a peddler to report their strength, population, and vulnerability to General Jackson. Nancy was 20 years old when she was captured by the Yankees and jailed in a dilapidated house with guards constantly patrolling the building, but Nancy gained the trust of one of her guards, got his weapon from him, shot him, and escaped. After the war, Nancy married Joshua Douglas and settled right here in Virginia. Elizabeth Van Lew asked to be allowed to visit Union prisoners held by the Confederates in Richmond and began taking them food and medicines. She realized that many of the prisoners had been marched through Confederate lines on their way to Richmond and were full of useful information about Confederate movements. She became a spy for the North for the next 4 years, setting up a network of couriers and devising a code. For her efforts during the Civil War, Elizabeth Van Lew was made postmaster of Richmond by General Grant. After she died, in appreciation of her loyalty to her country, the people of Massachusetts had a gravestone erected on her grave which read, "She risked everything that is dear to man, friends, fortune, comfort, health, life itself, all for the one absorbing desire of her heart, that slavery might be abolished and the Union preserved." Major Pauline Cushman spied for the Union, often as an actress. Her many adventures were capitalized upon by P.T. Barnum. And throughout the war, Fairfax, Virginia resident Antonia Ford, who we're going to hear more about in a moment, impressed soldiers from north and south with her beauty, charm, and conversation. Impressed with her ability to recall those conversations, Jeb Stewart awarded her a written commission as my honorary aide-de-camp. And let me close. We'll hear more about her in a moment, and she's an exciting person. Rose O'Neal Greenhow was a leader in Washington society and one of the most renowned spies in the Civil War. She's credited with helping General Pierre G.T. Beauregard win the Battle of Bull Run. She spied so well for the Confederacy that Jefferson Davis credited her with winning the Battle of Manassas. Rose O'Neal Greenhow was imprisoned for her efforts, first on house arrest in her own home and then in Washington, D.C.'s old Capitol Prison for 5 months. After her second prison term, she was exiled to the Confederate States, where she received a heroine's welcome by Confederate President Jefferson Davis. So, gives you a little perspective on some of the women who have played an important role in the Civil War spying. We're going to hear more in-depth about this in a moment from our speaker tonight. We're very pleased to have Chuck Mauro. Chuck is an historian. He's written a great deal about Virginia, a great deal about Alexandria, and a great deal about spies. And without further ado, Chuck, welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here tonight. I appreciate you all coming out to hear a little of this talk about Laura. And, hold on. It's coming. It'll come up. I don't know if we can dim some of the lights.
We can.
It's coming.
And none of this is going to be available to Edward Snowden for any kind of...
No. While we're waiting for that, they talked about the distinguished speakers that I am following. My good friend Don Hackinson, who has spoken here in the past, is here to help me sell a few books tonight. So I appreciate Don coming to help me, and I know some of you have enjoyed his talks as well. What Paul started to talk about was one aspect of the war that I particularly find interesting, and that's the story about the civilians. You know, one of the things we tend to forget about the war, you think about the battles, you think about the generals, you think about the soldiers, but the Civil War went on in these people's backyards, in Alexandria, northern Virginia, in Fairfax County. Okay, you had the Union soldiers here, and you had the Union soldiers in the eastern part of Fairfax County, and guys like, Colonel John Mosby came in and did the attacks. There was only 2 main battles in Fairfax County, but still you had soldiers, both sides, coming and going, kept the general population in a state of alarm throughout the entire war. And while Paul introduced some of the women that were spies, I'm going to talk about one woman in particular. And before I do, one of the interesting things you have to think about, what was the role of women before the Civil War started? It's not at all what it was, what women are today. At the time of the Civil War, most Americans were farmers. Okay, they were all engaged in raising livestock or foodstuffs or whatever. So men worked the farm, and the women were in charge of taking care of the household. They were in charge of helping with the farm workers as much as they could, but they were mainly in charge of the children, preparing the food, making clothes, and so forth. So that was the life that most women led. In the South, a woman's place was truly in the home. Southern women before the war did not leave the house without a male escort. Okay? They didn't speak their minds outside of the house. Okay? And they didn't speak in public about what was going on in the war. They started to during the war, but before it was they were at home, they were at place in the house. So what happens during the war? This role is going to change. Why? What happens to all the men? They're not there anymore. And if you weren't home to protect your property or house, it didn't matter if the Union soldiers or the Confederate soldiers came by. If they wanted to use your house for something, they would just come in. If they thought you were cooking bread and they wanted that bread, they'd just come in and take it. And there's many a woman that literally had to stand with their hands in front of the door to her house to keep either soldiers from either side from coming in and taking what they wanted. So as a backdrop from what I'm about to talk about, you have to think about the role of women coming out of the house and taking care of their own needs themselves, because the men weren't around to do it anymore. So with that as a background, I'm going to start a little bit in Fairfax County in the fall of 1861 and then into the spring of 1862. This gentleman up here, Brigadier General Jeb Stewart at the time, was in charge of all the Confederate forces after the First Battle of Manassas. Okay? After the First Battle of Manassas, the Union soldiers come back into the forts in Alexandria and eastern Fairfax County. Jeb Stewart comes as far as Falls Church and in Fairfax as well to keep an eye on those Union soldiers. See if they're ever going to come back out of the eastern area. The second part of it, which is we don't think about, is the Confederate soldiers came out of Manassas as much as to keep an eye on the soldiers, as well as to find food, okay, that the Union soldiers may have left behind. So it's a dual purpose here. Mr. Stewart's camp headquarters was on West Ox Road and Route 50. It was called when you look at it, it's called the Millen House, M-I-L-L-A-N, but the true Southerners know it was called the Mellon House. And the name of his headquarters here was Camp Qui Vive, which was really French for who goes there, which was appropriate, because if he's on the front end of the Confederate lines, Union soldiers aren't too far away, so who goes there was a good name for his headquarters here. Now the story between that we'll talk about with Laura Ratcliffe is, as we know, Stewart has a battle in Drainesville. And the Battle of Drainesville was the Confederate soldiers were out looking for hay for their horses, and the Union general was out looking for hay for his horses. Okay, so they met, they battled. Jeb Stewart retreated. The Union General Ord held the battlefield after the battle, so Union soldiers won. But Stewart takes some of his wounded soldiers back to this church on called Frying Pan Church on Centerville Road, and that church is still there today. Now, Laura Ratcliffe lived on Centerville Road, 1.5 miles south of this particular church. And while it is recorded that Laura Ratcliffe did also go about 7.5 miles over to Camp Qui Vive to tend to Stewart's wounded soldiers there, I personally believe that she probably tended to his wounded soldiers here, because it was written he left some soldiers here. There were some doctors that came to tend to those soldiers, and there were some local women who also came to tend to those wounded soldiers. So this is where Laura meets Jeb Stewart, and it was written that Stewart was captivated by Laura's beauty, helpfulness, and good nature. Okay, so who's Laura Ratcliffe? A little bit about Jeb Stewart there. Well, she was the great-granddaughter of a Richard Ratcliffe, who founded the town of Providence in 1800. And what had happened was, if you know your Alexandria history, the courthouse was in Alexandria, and at the time was in a dilapidated condition. So Fairfax County decided to build another courthouse a little bit further outside of Alexandria, more to the center of Fairfax County. And Mr. Richard Ratcliffe was a lawyer. He was a very smart lawyer. He donated 4 acres of his property so they could build the courthouse. Okay, and that's where he worked after it was built. And this courthouse, of course, was built in 1800 on land he donated. And of course, even though it was the town of Providence, it became called Fairfax Courthouse during the war, and it's now the city of Fairfax. As I mentioned, Laura was his great-granddaughter. She was born in 1836. I believe this picture was taken around 1855, about the time she was about 20 years old. She had 1 brother and she had 2 sisters. So part of the fun of doing the research was trying to figure out exactly where Laura lived. So here's a little bit of a map of Fairfax Courthouse. Now the courthouse is right here, as I just showed a picture. In 1840 and 1850, her family was living on 2 to 3 acres of the 300-acre plot of this Abner Stevenson. So a little bit southwest of the courthouse, we don't know exactly where, but that's where the census tells us that she was living. In 1860, she has moved somewhere along Main Street here through Fairfax County, and I believe she was probably living with Margaret Farr or perhaps Harrison Monroe, because they were relatives. There's no record of Laura's father after 1852. So they didn't own this property. They're on the census, but they're not in the tax records. So I believe that Laura probably grew up poor, because it was written about Richard Ratcliffe's children that they mismanaged their property so badly that their heirs had to sell off their property to pay their debts. And it's true that Laura's father had sold off his property in Fairfax Courthouse, perhaps to pay off some of his debts. But I think this growing up poor is something that made Laura very independent. And she was, she had to make do for herself. So, as we said, Laura meets Jeb Stewart in December of 1861. Stewart is in Northern Virginia all the way up to March of 1862 through the winter. Laura and Jeb Stewart went sleigh riding together, it's recorded. They wrote letters to each other. And I picked this particular letter because it ties in with what Paul was talking about. If you can read it there, it says, Miss Laura, here's a letter from Jeb Stewart to Miss Laura Ratcliffe and Miss Antonia Ford in Frying Pan. And that's the area that, it's just south of Herndon, where Laura lived. And another aspect of the war that we have to think about is when people went to visit somebody, they didn't just go over for the Redskins game, have a few beers, and drive home. Okay? When they traveled back then, they would probably stay for a fortnight, or they would stay for a while. So Jeb Stewart, as we've heard, Antonia Ford was giving him information about what was going on in the Fairfax Courthouse area. Laura Ratcliffe was giving him information about what was going over in the western end of Fairfax County. So this is written from Jeb Stewart, and it's written from Centerville on January 30th, 1862. So this is about a month after they've met. And if you can read along with me, it says, "My dear ladies." It is such a muddy day that I refrain from visiting you because I would dislike to appear in such an unpresentable a costume as the roads would give me. Nevertheless, you may expect me soon, rain or shine. Yours, Jeb. In other words, let's face it, the roads weren't so hot back then. Another reason why he didn't travel all that frequently. And he didn't want to come and visit them in the middle of January because he would have been very muddy. Okay, but they can expect him soon, rain or shine. So, in the book that I have on Laura, I have 4 such letters that Jeb Stewart had written to Laura. In March of 1862, the Confederate Army is going to move out of Northern Virginia. They've been there through the winter. Confederate Army is actually over in Centerville, and they decide to move south just in case the Yankees do come out of eastern Fairfax County in Alexandria and attack them again. And as he's pulling out, Jeb Stewart sends an album to Miss Laura Ratcliffe. He gave Antonia Ford this captain's certificate as an aide-de-camp, which she kept. Unfortunately, that was found, okay, and she got arrested. Laura did a better job of hiding this album, or perhaps she might have been arrested too, but since it was never found, she was not arrested. And it's really just an album of blank paper. The only page that's printed is the first page here. And you can say it says presented to Miss Laura Ratcliffe by her soldier friend, as a token of his high appreciation for his patriotism, admiration of her virtue, and pledge of his lasting esteem. All right, Stewart's a married man. He's given these nice little things out to these women. What are we to make of this? In addition to this front page, Jeb Stewart writes 4 poems. Okay, 2 he writes and 2 he kind of copies from other poems. Now, guys, I want you to remember these first 2 lines. These are perfect for Valentine's Day. To Laura, we once met by chance, yet in that vengeful chance, the mystic web of destiny was woven. All right, is that good stuff? All right. You can see that would work, okay? So what are we to make of Jeb Stewart? And Jeb Stewart's wife was visiting him over there at Camp Key Vive, while Laura's 7.5 miles away. So what are we to make of Mr. Stewart? Well, one of his biographers wrote, Stewart used the attention of women as an index of his worth. More than most men, he treasured his flirtations and in a sense, counted them as conquests. In other words, if Jeb Stewart could get a kiss on a cheek from a pretty girl or a lock of a hair, that was a Victorian era sign of a conquest. One of his men wrote, unsurpassed for close attention to duty, General Stewart had the remarkable facility of preserving his lightness of heart under all circumstances. He was as conspicuous a leader in the ballroom as he was on the field of battle. And if you read a little bit about Jeb Stewart, you notice whenever he goes to a new town, he always takes the headquarters of the gentleman who has the prettiest daughters in town. Okay, and that's where he has his balls and his dances. But this is a Victorian era where flirting is something that he's quite good at. And then he writes to his wife, Flora. He said, as to being laughed at about your husband's fondness for society and ladies, all I can say is that you are better off in that than you would be if I were fonder of some other things that excite no remarks in others. So he's not drinking, he's not gambling, but he does enjoy the ladies when he's in town. So why did Jeb Stewart write this poem to Laura? Why did he give Antonia Ford a captain's certificate? What did he want from the women? He wanted them to provide information about the Union soldiers. And if you provide information to one army about the other, by definition, you are a spy. So these women were spies. And I dare say that any woman or man, either Union or Confederate, would give information to their army about the opposition, okay, making a lot of people spies, which, of course, Laura and Antonia have a little bit more going on. So in this album, as I said, the rest of the pages are blank. The album, by the way, was printed in Philadelphia. Jeb Stewart has it. One of the things another tradition I have to talk about at the time was when you went to somebody's house. You know, we didn't text them that we were coming or phone call them. The tradition at the time was you would take your calling card and you would go knock on the door, the servant would answer, and you would present your calling card. And that servant would take the card to whoever it was you wanted to see in the house. And they could either admit you or say they wouldn't see you, and if they wouldn't see you, they had 3 days to get back to you and say when you could come or they didn't want to see you. So this idea of using calling cards was the way people went and visited other people. So, do you think that the the Confederate soldiers, when they came to Laura's house during the war, would present a calling card, put it on the silver tray in the front hall? I don't think so. What Laura did, this happens to be Laura's calling card. Should have had that up there while I was talking about the calling cards. But what Laura did is she drew the calling cards on the blank pages of this album. And when the soldiers came in, they would sign it. So again, this is the custom of the day. There are 40 such signatures in this one album. 26 are from soldiers, 14 are from loyal Confederate civilians. Now you can read some of these things. I'm not going to go through everybody on here. But you can see right in the middle it says, your friend, Jeb Stewart. And again, it was written about Jeb Stewart. He was either your friend or he was your enemy. There was no in between. So we know where Jeb Stewart falls on the side of Laura. What I will point out on this at the top are two of Stewart's favorite scouts during the Civil War, John Mosby and Captain William Farley. Farley was known as Farley the Scout. Stewart was in the cavalry and he relied on his scouts. William Downs Farley was killed on June 3rd, 1863 in Brandy Station. Mosby will live, of course, through the war, and we'll talk about him a little bit more. It's also interesting that, where's William Mosby on this one? Hairston, Mosby's brother is on a different page. But upside down over here, W.P. Berkeley, Alexandria. Okay, we're going to talk about Mr. William Berkeley, a civilian from Alexandria, as we go through here. Okay, here's another page, signed by the Gray Ghost himself, John Mosby. Mosby is right up here. He's a major. Okay, there's William Mosby. That's his brother. And those of you guys that are really Mosby fans, you see William H. Chapman. He's a captain, one of Mosby's captains, one of Mosby's most trusted men, captain of Company C. And then down here is Walter Franklin. He's also a captain of Company F. So, Stewart, one of the things that you don't know about these signatures is when they were signed. There's no dates on them. So I had to go back and do the research. There's probably 2 times that we know for sure that Stewart was in Laura's house. Mosby was in and out of this area of western Fairfax County a number of times. As a matter of fact, Mosby was a major for all of 6 months. And even in that 6 months, he had a raid to Frying Pan in October of '63. There was a raid in Vienna in November of '63. There was another raid on Vienna, January '64. A raid on Falls Church, September '64. And then a raid that Willie was there, I know for sure, on Chain Bridge in September '64. And there's another 12 times that Mosby would have been going past the house of Laura as he was coming into the eastern portion of Fairfax County to do raids on the Union soldiers. And as we'll talk about, there's 2 other times when they all could have been there. One is on December 29th, 1862. That's the night before Stewart actually gives Mosby his first 9 men for his independent command. And they were also, all these men were here during the Battle of Chantilly, the major battle of Fairfax County in September of '62. Here's another guy. See if you recognize this gentleman. He was a local guy, born and lived just outside of Alexandria. Brigadier General Fitzhugh Lee. Okay, he signs it. You can see he signs the album right there in the middle. Fitzhugh Lee and some of his men. Fitzhugh Lee, in case you didn't know, was the nephew of one Robert E. Lee. Okay, he met Jeb Stewart at West Point and was one of Stewart's most trusted generals during the war. Let me see if I can find these real quick. There's a John Scott here, okay, and he doesn't sign with any military. John Scott is the founder of what was called the Black Horse Cavalry during the war. He didn't have a very distinguished career, and he comes out of the military. But his claim to fame, if you will, is he writes the Partisan Ranger Act. The Partisan Ranger Act is the act that allows John Mosby to then become an independent guerrilla. And what the Partisan Ranger Act, it was written for captains on the high sea. When you captured another boat, you were able to keep what you captured. And what it allowed for Mosby was when he captured Union soldiers, he was allowed to keep what he captured from those Union soldiers. So here we have John Scott signing on here. We have a J.C. Coleman, which is a member, and I'll talk about his sister, believe it or not, who signs this as well. So this is Fitzhugh Lee, and this is some of his men who sign. Now, as I said, they could have been there probably on December 29th or the Battle of Chantilly. So here's a little bit about where Laura lives. Though this is Centerville Road, this is Frying Pan Church up here, which fell into ruins during the war. Herndon is right up here. The toll road goes right along here. In case you're interested in that, Centerville goes route down here. And here's Laura Radcliffe here. It turns out that Laura had been living in Fairfax Courthouse area, and I believe when the Union soldiers came, she moved out here to Centerville Road because her sister was married to Mr. Coleman up here. And rather than live in the Fairfax Courthouse where those Yankee soldiers were, she moved a little bit west out here to Centerville Road to be near her sister. Again, she did not own this property. The man that owned this property, we have records from him, he did not live there during the war. So I believe that the arrangement was made perhaps for Laura to stay there, and he lived in Washington and Baltimore during the war, and she took care of his property, which is about where it would have been. Now, here's a picture of the house that she lived in from 1950. Of course, it's a little bit different in 1950 than it was now. But I've spoken to some people that had lived in here. And over here on the right, there is the room went from the front here, after this front porch, to the back of the house, would have been the largest room in the house. So as I said, other than the Battle of Chantilly, one night stands out, and that's December 29th, 1862. Mosby, Fitzhugh Lee, and Stewart are all recorded as being in this house. He was coming up from the south. He did a raid on Dumfries on December 26th. He did the raid on Burke Station on December 28th, where he sends the famous telegram off to the quartermaster in Washington complaining about the poor quality of the mules that he has just captured. But he's also here. He's also here. And it was written that during that night, they'd come to visit Laura, again, probably to get information about the Union soldiers in the vicinities. The Union pickets were 1.5 miles up the road at Frying Pan Church. And as Stewart is getting ready to leave, Laura says, "It's a shame that you can't stay longer, General. It's hard on us, living in conquered territory under enemy rule." And Stewart replies, "Well, I won't desert you entirely, Miss Ratcliffe. I'm returning to Culpeper in the morning, as you know, but I mean to leave behind Captain Mosby, behind with a few men to look after the loyal Confederate people here until we can return in force and victory." So, this is the first night that Mosby finds out that Stewart is going to finally grant his request to give him an independent command. He can operate under that Partisan Ranger Act that I spoke about. It's not till the next day, December 30th, at this house called Oakham in Loudoun County, where Stewart actually gives Mosby 9 men to give his independent command. And I know I don't want to ramble on too much, but I will tell you a story. When I was doing the photography for this particular book, I had John Hackinson there and another gentleman by the name of Tom Evans take me around and help me find some of these locations. And I'm driving down the road, and we go past this house, and Don very quietly says, "Oh, that's Oakham." I went, "What?" I said, "That's Oakham? That's where you're Mosby?" He goes, "Yeah, that's where Mosby, got his command." So we went on to Aldie Mill, turned around, came back, and this is the trick that I use. You may use it too if you wish. I give it to you for free. You drive up to a house. You don't know if anybody's home. You don't know the owner. Here's the trick. You drive up, you get out of the car, you slam that car door as loud as you can. Okay, that tells the people in the house that somebody's outside. Turned out that it was a caretaker. And the first thing that comes bounding out of the house are the big 2 dogs. So you learn, you stand there just like that. And then finally the caretaker came out. And we told her what we were doing. Actually, I pushed Don up there when the dogs came out. He's bigger than I am. So we told this caretaker what we were doing. She says, oh, okay, I understand. We got to go in the house. I don't show it here, but I took pictures in every room in the house, in the front and the back. So Don, Tom Evans, and I can say we stood where Mosby got his first 9 men. Just one of the fun things you do, that we do that. So, as Stewart had promised Mosby would stay behind, to protect the women of the South, it turns out that Laura saves his life. 2 months later, in February, so this is December 30th, 2 months later, in February, Laura warns Mosby of a Union trap. Okay? Put this house up here. Mosby wrote about this in his memoirs. He said, we then proceeded on towards Frying Pan, where I heard that a cavalry picket was stationed and waiting for me to come to visit them. I did not want to disappoint them in their desire to visit Richmond. When I got within a mile of it and had stopped for a few minutes to make my dispositions for attack, I observed 2 ladies walking rapidly toward me. One was Miss Laura Radcliffe, a young lady to whom Stewart had introduced me a few weeks before when returning from his raid on Dumfries with her sister. Their home was near Frying Pan, and they had got information of a plan to capture me, and were just going to capture me, and they were going to the house of a citizen, this house here, her brother-in-law's house, to get him to put me on my guard, where fortune brought them across my path. But for meeting them, my life as a partisan ranger would have been closed that day. So what had happened was, there was a crossroads on Centerville Road and probably the old West Ox Road. And what the Union soldiers do, they knew that Mosby had started his raids and he was coming through western Fairfax County. So they knew that he would probably come by, and some of his very first raids were on that Frying Pan church. So they were ready for him. What they did is they put a few pickets in the crossroads and then hit a couple hundred soldiers in the trees around the crossroads. The idea was to entice Mosby to come in and capture the pickets like he normally did, and then the soldiers would rush out of the trees and capture Mosby. So what happens is this one young Union soldier comes to Laura's house, perhaps a day or two before, and probably the day before, and says, we know you're a pal of Mosby. And by the time next time you see your pal, he'll either be dead or captured. He said, we know you would give Mosby any information that you have, but because the roads are full of mud and you have no horses and you are women folk, you won't be able to tell him. So the minute this young Union soldier leaves, Laura and her sister put on their coats, walk up Centerville Road, stopping at the house of every civilian that they know to ask if they've seen Mosby. And they happen to come to this house, to her brother-in-law's house, which is up where the World Gate Marriott is, or the World Gate Shopping Center is. And as they're standing in this house, they look out the window, and here comes Mosby. And they walk out, and they save him. And they tell him that the Union soldiers are down there. Mosby bypasses the picket. He actually goes up to the Herndon train station and robs a sutler up there, and then takes off. So she does save his life, as Mosby has said. Here's another idea, just to give you a little bit of idea, a better picture of where Laura lives. She lives up here. That was her house during the Civil War. She lives just up the road here, and another house we'll talk about after the Civil War. Okay, Alexandria here, Fairfax Courthouse here. And I show you this picture because we'll skip now from the soldiers who signed this album to some of the civilians who signed this album. As I said, there were 14 civilians. 13 were who? Women. Okay? This one guy from Alexandria, we got to figure him out yet. But there's 5 local women that signed this album. And I say, with a little joke, they gave Laura the news because they lived to the north, they lived to the east, they lived to the west, and they lived to the south. So Laura's living here. She's got one of the women living out here in Leesburg, one up here in Drainesville, one down here in Chantilly, and one over here in Fairfax Courthouse. And these local women signed this album. Okay? Lucy Coleman. Lucy Cockrell. Okay? Molly Millen. Laura Monroe lived at Fairfax Courthouse. Kate Coleman. Here's Molly. Molly lived to the south. It's actually down along Route 50 where the Chantilly Costco is. Okay, she lived in a house that was called the Hermitage. So these women were getting together. We don't know exactly how they did, but I'm sure they traveled and they got together. I'll tell you a little interesting story about Molly. Okay, in the very beginning of the war, right after the First Battle of Manassas, the Confederates were in charge of most of Fairfax County. the South Carolinians were in the area of the Hermitage here. And Molly and her sister, they were young girls at the time, used to sit on this front porch and swing. And these two soldier boys from South Carolina come by, and then Molly and her sister Virginia were providing them with food. And these soldiers told Molly and Virginia, we're going to come back after the war and marry you two. And they did. And that was the story. And not only that, during the war, Molly and her sister used to provide Mosby with food. Okay? And they used to play the piano and sing for him. The reason we know that is because her sister wrote an article in 1921 in the Confederate Veteran magazine saying that they had, entertained the South Carolinians during the war, and they had entertained Mosby during the war. And Mosby actually wrote a little paragraph saying that this was true. So it's kind of an interesting article. On another page was a woman that I mentioned, Kate Harper. And she lived to the north in a house called Bloomfield. Now this house is still there. The other one is, it's got Costco and Walmart there. But this house is still up on Route 7. It is across from the Drainsville Tavern. If you're ever going down Route 7 and you see that Drainsville Tavern on one side, you just kind of have to just stop, look across Route 7. There's some trees, but there's a little road that goes up, and that road goes back there to this house. And what's interesting about Kate is she wrote a diary during the war. She kept a diary during the war. And I found it very interesting. It's called Journey to Bloomfield. It's been out of print. It has now been reprinted. I know you can get it at the Virginia Room in the regional library in the city of Fairfax. So she signs this album as well. Then we get to 7 other women, which took me a while to figure out. They lived not in Alexandria, not up here at Frying Pan, not up here at Drainsville with Kate. They lived all the way over here in Cambridge, Maryland. Okay? And here are these 7 women signing this album, which would have been up here. So we have to so I had to figure out, okay, what's the connection with all these women? Well, it turns out they all went to Christ Episcopal Church. So these 7 women were Episcopalian. Laura's Episcopalian. Kate Harper's Episcopalian. Remember I mentioned this gentleman, William Berkeley from Alexandria? He's Episcopalian. Okay, so perhaps there's a religious tie here. Although there's no records from any of these churches anymore during the Civil War, so we don't have that. But that was the first thing I noticed. However, how do you think these women would have gotten there? Very simple. They would have taken a boat, Cambridge, down the Chesapeake Bay, up the Potomac River to Alexandria. Who's in Alexandria that signs this album? William Berkeley. So I believe that these women traveled here, up here, and then William Berkeley would have met them in Alexandria and taken them on up to either Kate Harper's house or Laura's house. I actually believe they probably stayed at Kate Harper's house up there in Bloomfield. It's a much bigger, it's actually a nice big house. Laura's house was also kind of small. Turns out that they also signed, in a minute you'll see, they signed the same page as Kate Harper. But I still had to find a connection. What was the connection between Laura, perhaps, and these women? So here's Christ Episcopal Church down in Cambridge. This is not the church that was there during the Civil War, but most of these women are still buried in the cemetery behind this particular church. Well, okay, so here's our buddy again, William Berkeley of Alexandria. Here's all these women from Cambridge, if you can read. There's Kate Harper from Bloomfield. So that, to me, that ties these women from Cambridge probably to Kate Harper's house. But I had to figure out how to do this, how to find it out. So I'd driven to Cambridge. Luckily for me, my sister lives in Cambridge, so I had a place to stay in the week when I was down there doing the research. And the way I finally figured it out was I had to hire the help of a genealogist. Okay? Turns out many of these women were all related, down in Cambridge and related up here. And who they were related to, well, here's the one woman. There's a Wilhelmina G. Henry. I know it's hard to read, but that G stands for Goldsboro. And there was a Goldsboro up here in Fairfax County. I know you won't recognize her, but this is Anna Marie Goldsboro Fitzhugh of Ravensworth, which was the largest estate in Fairfax County. She happens to be the godmother of Fitzhugh Lee, who we've already seen his signature. She's the aunt of Robert E. Lee, and she happens to be a cousin of Wilhelmina Goldsboro Henry down in Cambridge. Turns out that Anna Marie here was born in Cambridge and then moved up here to get married to a Fitzhugh. So how many of you here are genealogists? All right, I have to say right here and now, I love genealogists because genealogy hurts my head, okay? Every time you think you found somebody, is it the person you're looking for? No. Drives me nuts. You get the right name, but it's not the right time period. So I actually had to hire a genealogist, and she came up with this connection. Anna Marie Goldsboro Fitzhugh was married to a William Henry Fitzhugh. Okay, you ready for this? He was Laura's third cousin, twice removed on Laura's father's side. Okay, now you know why I hire a genealogist. So it turns out that her husband was related to Laura's father. Okay, and it turns out that they both went to church in Fairfax Courthouse at the Zion Episcopal Church, which of course is no longer there. So they would have seen each other during the war, and if the women from Cambridge were coming up to Fairfax Courthouse, they would have probably, Anna Marie was a very wealthy woman, she probably would have helped pay for the transportation. But then you got to figure out, well, why'd they come here? Okay? We'll never know for sure, because there's not much written about these women. However, early in the war, there was a railroad that went into Cambridge. Union soldiers took over that railroad, and they took over Cambridge. And it would not be, I would not be surprised one iota if the Southern women could not, it would be an affront to them to have these Yankee soldiers in their town, so they would leave. It turns out one of the women's brothers was actually stationed in Fairfax Courthouse in the early part of the war. So they could have had some sort of Episcopalian connection to come up here to get away from the soldiers. They could have been coming to bring supplies to one of the women's brothers. We'll never know, but I think it makes kind of an interesting story. But again, they would have traveled by boat, met William Berkeley, and probably stayed there at Kate Harper's house. William Berkeley lived in Alexandria after the war. In 1877, he lived at 116 Prince Street. In 1883, he lived at 601 King Street, for what it's worth. Some of you, I'm sure, will recognize that. Let's move on a little bit after the war. This is the house that, after the war, Laura's mother sells some property that she has in 1870 and buys this particular house. It was called Brookside. And it was written about Laura that at the end of the war, Laura was destitute with a dilapidated house surrounded by weeds, her fences down, the farm grown up in tall grass and briars. Her once productive farmlands were trodden down by the enemy's cavalry. Well, I don't know if it was the enemy's cavalry, but somebody's cavalry. And they was growing up in brambles. But that was true about everything in Fairfax County. Everything was in pretty bad shape. Laura's brother, John, died of chronic diarrhea in Chimborazo Hospital on October 29th, 1864. And this is his marker. He's buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Richmond, and he's number 112 on that particular marker there. So Laura does lose her brother during the war. As I said, in 1869, Laura's mother buys this house and calls it Brookside. She has 18 acres there. Later, a subsequent owner names it Marybrook in 1948, because this is right on the side of Centerville Road. There's a little brook that runs down in front of the house. So it was called Brookside. No doubt she was struggling to make ends meet after the war. She was probably selling what she could to a local man who probably brought her produce into perhaps Alexandria or the city of Washington. But in 1890, we're going to jump ahead. When Laura was 50 years old, she marries her next door neighbor. Her mother had passed away, her sister had become an invalid, and Laura's caring for her sister. And when her sister passes away, she marries her next door neighbor, a gentleman by the name of Milton Hanna, who's from New York, but he was quite wealthy. As Antonia Ford married her Union captor, Laura also marries a Northerner. And although this marriage took Laura from being destitute to wealthy, the marriage only lasted for 7 years because her husband is killed felling a tree on this property 7 years after they are married. However, he leaves 200 acres to her. So Laura's becoming quite wealthy as the years go by. And that's a picture of the house, the end of the house where she lived. The house on the left side there has been added on to a couple more times over the years. But this is a picture of the house of Marybrook. And Laura did not go on about her role during the Civil War, after the war. In 1910, however, Mosby's men hold their 16th reunion at this Darlington estate in Herndon. And one of the speakers there that day, one of the speakers referred especially to the service rendered to Mosby by Miss Laura Ratcliffe, a venerable woman who gave the guerrilla valuable information as to the movements of federal troops. So she's remembered, although she herself doesn't talk about it. And if you look on this picture here, you see these flagstones right here. That went out to the chicken coop. Okay, in 1914, when Laura was 78 years old, she's going out to feed her chickens, and she slips and falls on these flagstones. And she apparently breaks her hip. Now we say apparently because the town doctor was what? He was a man. Laura's not about to let any man examine her. So she lives the final 9 years in bed in this house, and she dies in 1923 at 87 years old. And we never know for sure the exact nature of her injury because she never had a doctor. But the local people would still come by and visit her, and she was considered beautiful up to the end, wore dangly earrings, and was considered a local legend. So after Laura dies, what happens to this album? Not only the album, Jeb Stewart gives her a watch chain during the war with a gold coin on it. Where does that go? It goes to when Laura passes in her will, before she passes away, she gives Mary Book to a much younger cousin, Mamie Wiley. Mamie's buried in the Fairfax Cemetery in the city of Fairfax. And that album and chain were passed on to Mamie Wiley's descendants. She actually wrote in her will, let's see, that's a not so good picture of the chain and the gold coin because I've never seen it. I got this out of a magazine article. I think I know, I obviously know who owns that album because the gentleman allowed me, who he'd bought it. He's a good Civil War collector, and he let me photograph the pages of the album. I think I know who has this watch chain, but I've never been able to get to the family. I know somebody who's a member of the family, but they never seem to get to him. Someday, you never know. Laura is buried. In her will, she says, I wish to have put upon my own graveyard a neat gray granite stone with the names of Radcliffe, Coleman, and Hannah cut on it. So Radcliffe would be for her mother, Hannah is for her husband, and Coleman is for her sister, because this is on that George Coleman property that I talked about that's up there in Herndon. This is literally right outside the World Gate Marriott. If you walk out of that front door and look at 10 o'clock, you'll see it's surrounded by some trees. I'm not sure they like to see a graveyard. They're having all the guests walk by a graveyard on the way in, but her granite stone is right there. So, summing this all up, here's a woman who started with this southern, concept of womanhood in the South, had to make do for herself. She not only made did for herself, she made did for her, her country's officers and soldiers as well. So I think she was a very brave and daring woman to have these Confederate soldiers in her house 1.5 miles from the Union picket post up the road. And it's kind of interesting, where the women were dependent upon the men in the beginning of the war, the men are now dependent upon the women for their information during the war. So I think that makes it kind of interesting. If you walk out of that World Gate Marriott, you'll see this sign, so it's not too hard to find the gravestone. It's right there. This was done in November of 2007. A sign was put up, a Virginia Historical Highway marker, by the Friends of Laura Ratcliffe. And is the case, and is always the case, after you write the book, then people call you up. They say, oh, you wrote a book about Laura. Guess what I have? Well, that picture that I had of Laura is really a drawing. Because what happened is, in 1855, the photography was of daguerreotypes. There was no way to copy a daguerreotype. But there was an industry, if you wanted a copy, that they would come and they would draw that picture. So I didn't realize it at the time I wrote the book, but this guy calls me up and he's got the daguerreotype of Laura, and that's what it actually looks like. And actually the drawing is very, very good. The only difference in the drawing is you really can't tell this brooch right here. It's much more prominent in the drawing than it is in that, from the original daguerreotype here. So I finally got a hold of that. I mean, this daguerreotype is 2 inches by 2.5 inches. They are tiny little things. So, you know, you do the research, you write the book, and then you get the phone call. So I'm still hoping that one day somebody calls me up and says she's got a diary. I'd love to read that. Don't know if one exists. But with that, I will finish up and ask if there are any questions. Thank you. Oh, if you have questions, is the microphone right there?
Right in the center of the room.
Yeah, if you have a question, could you walk over there and do it in the, ask your question in the mic so we'll get it on the video. If you want to put some lights on, we can do that. Thank you. It's there, believe me.
Okay. Do we know how she learned of Jeb Stewart's death? Any input as to what happened afterwards?
She probably would have learned it through the newspapers, and she probably would have been very sorrowful. There's actually writings that she was scared to death whenever they were in the house. You know, as much as she liked having them for protection, but having them in the house is not a good thing. But yeah, she would have learned about it through the newspapers. As most of the civilians would have learned about the events. You know, we talked about, you know, events going on, you know, to the north here, you know, 150 years ago. They would have learned about the Battle of Gettysburg. And what's also I find very fascinating is the initial reports about these battles are always wrong. You know, they've always got one side winning, and then when the final news comes out, what was the other side? So it's kind of interesting. You know, getting information from the newspapers was, you know, you think they would have probably realized halfway through the war that, you know, they had to wait. Of course, the most important thing they got from the newspapers were the rolls of the dead soldiers, because one of the interesting, one of the things we don't think about during the war, is that it was civilians were doing the fighting, and these civilians all knew each other, okay? And whenever there was a battle, they would go and read the newspaper to find out who was killed from their town or from their area. So that's how they found out about it. Yes, ma'am.
How did Laura manage not to be in prison like the other ladies?
It's a good question. How did Laura manage to be in prison? That one Union soldier that came to her house said, "We know you're a pal of Mosby." Well, look at it this way. During the war, you knew, the civilians knew and the soldiers knew who were a Southerner and who was a Northerner, okay? If you were a Confederate, the Southerners were nice to you, and if you're a Northerner, they were not nice to you. As I said, a definition of a spy is anybody that would give information to one army about the other. I bet that everybody in the area would give information, okay, about the opposing army. You couldn't arrest everybody, okay? There were always orders to arrest men or to burn the houses of men that were caught giving information about, the Union generals as they came through would have orders to have people arrested or have their houses burned. It would take extraordinary circumstances to arrest a woman. Now, and I don't know if I mentioned, where Antonia Ford was visiting Laura, they were cousins, okay? They were related. Poor Antonia Ford was a scapegoat, because after Mosby does his most famous raid in Fairfax Courthouse, okay, and captures Brigadier General Stoughton, well, Stoughton had been staying in Antonia's Ford partying the night before, okay? So they were looking to catch somebody. So what they did, she was well known to the soldiers, so they sent another woman, she was a Southerner, as a Union sympathizer, befriends Antonia. Antonia shows her certificate, and that's how she gets caught. As I said, if the Union soldiers had caught Laura with this album, she probably would have been arrested, okay? But she did not get caught, with a proverbial smoking gun. So, as I said, they couldn't arrest everybody, and they would not arrest that many women. Women were arrested if they were caught, red-handed doing something.
When war is being fought right in your backyard, everyone's seeing something, troop movements, supplies going hither and yon, and there's gradients of information. Mm-hmm. And some is, well, so what? And some's very strategic. What type, did she have really strategic information that could make the difference on an outcome of a military action? And if so, what was that?
So think of it this way. You've got this very pretty young girl looking out her window, and the Union soldiers are marching up and down Centerville Road. Some of them would be coming to the door for milk and eggs. She was living on farmland. She had to do something for food. Wouldn't be very hard for her to get information about the troops, who they were, where they were from, how many there were. One of the quotes that I have in the book is about Mosby. And one of the soldiers talks about Laura and her rebellious sisterhood. Providing information, it says usually Mosby is informed of not only what troops are there, but how many times they're changing their picket posts, when the posts are changed, and who's actually there. So Laura's somehow keeping a good watch or getting good information on this and passing it on to Mosby. Okay, Mosby would come in and he primarily would go after the smaller targets, these pickets. He captured the men, he wanted those horses. So he'd capture those pickets and move on. So they knew that she was giving information about it, but again, it didn't rise to the level of anything specifically happening that they could blame on her or catch her red-handed in. Yeah.
Just to carry on with the story about Antonia, it says here, and I want you to expand upon it if you would, that after she was supposedly responsible for providing information about a raid that John Mosby...
Mosby did Fairfax Courthouse, yeah.
Right. And the house was searched, and she was found to have had the commission, and Union Major Joseph C. Willard arrested and escorted the spy to the old Capitol prison.
Mm-hmm.
Along the way, Antonia is said to have stolen his heart, and 7 months later, Willard secured her release, and they were married.
That's
Is
all
that,
true. That's all very true. He arrested her, took her to the Capitol prison in the city of Washington, and they fell in love and they married. And he's the famous Willard from the Willard Hotel. So that is true. Well, let's face it, there weren't too many good Southern men around, you know? What's a poor girl to do? And as they said, it wasn't any disgrace to be considered an old maid back then. Which is actually surprising why, you know, to a sense, I'm kind of surprised that Laura did get married. Because, you know, it was written after the war. She rode her horse and she took care of her farmland. She was known, and it was her striking jet black hair, riding around she was very independent. So, any other questions? Thank you all very much.
Well, we want to once again thank Chuck. That was excellent. We're going to thank him in a very special way in a moment. I want to close by giving you one short little tale about one last special spy that I saved for the end. Though best known for her work in freeing slaves, after the outbreak of the Civil War, Harriet Tubman also served as a soldier, spy, and a nurse for a time serving at Fortress Monroe, where Jefferson Davis would later be imprisoned. Her experience leading slaves along the Underground Railroad was particularly helpful because she knew the landscape so well. She recruited a group of former slaves to scout the locations of rebel camps and report on the movement of the Confederate troops. In 1863, she actually went with Colonel James Montgomery and several black soldiers on a gunboat raid in South Carolina. Because Harriet Tubman had inside information from her scouts, the Union gunboats were able to surprise the Confederate rebels. So there are quite a few interesting tales, and we are really pleased tonight to have had the most in-depth understanding from Chuck about one very special story. And in light of that, we want to give Chuck, if you come back up, an honorarium. We want to thank you as we do all our speakers. And
thank you very much.
Greatly appreciate your time. And we want to encourage everyone to stop on up and meet Chuck and chat and buy one of his books. And we've got a few here. So thank you very much. And now, our chair, Bill Dickinson.
Okay, I want to invite you back to some light refreshments so you can meet and talk. Don't forget our survey. We will adjourn our activities for 2012, 2013. Stay tuned. Debbie is going to come up with a fantastic agenda for 2013, 2014, and we're going to try to balance it as far as all eras that you indicate in your survey that you want to hear from. We have a lot of candidates. So with that, we'll see you in the fall.